Your God is too small. Let me say that again. Your God is too small. You may be thinking, well, Dave, that's hyperbole. That's an accusation. That's somewhat of an insult. That's just some kind of oratorical flourish. You're just making a statement to get our attention. It is a, let's just say, a homiletical embellishment so that I can say something dramatic so that you'll say, well, maybe not, but it's not any of those things. It's absolutely and completely true. Our God is too small. And the reason I say that is because I understand how life works. And what happens is we have an idea about God, but we make the idea about God manageable. We have a comfortable God. We have a hip pocket God. Even those of us with the most sincere faith really are intimidated by the idea that God is unfathomable and that God is unmanageable, that to some extent God is unknowable and beyond comprehension. That idea intimidates us. And so even if we have a sincere faith, we wind up with what I call a 911 God, and in case of fire, break glass God, a God who backstops life in those times when it's beyond us. But most of the time, in the day-to-day, in the day-after-day life, we have a casual, comfortable relationship with God. And we make God into a manageable deity. Even those of you who may be skeptics or cynics or agnostics or even atheists, your compartmentalization of God, or seeing God just as a divine watchmaker who created the universe perhaps, or somehow was the uncaused first cause, if you give God the credit for some involvement as a higher power or just some other unknowable entity, all of us, I am convinced, 100%, me included, live our lives with too small a God. What I want to do is I want to start this year off by jumping into the deep end, by stepping off into the unknown, to plumb the unfathomable depths, the intimidating reality that we have a God that is beyond comprehension. I want to explore those ideas, those thoughts, those expressions about our awareness, about our consciousness, about how do we know what we know, what is the meaning of meaning, and where is God in the midst of an infinite universe. I want to dive off into the deep water. Not the deep end of the pool, but the Marianas Trench deep. The deep beyond our even imaginings. And I want to explore the idea that our God is too small. But before we dive into the deep end, I want to give you a chance to catch your breath. Take a deep breath before we dive in. And before we do that, would you pray with me? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight. That you would use your words spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit to challenge us to see you beyond what we can see and to know you beyond what we can know. May we be people who are invited into the mystery of an infinite God. Pray that for myself, for my family, and for all of us here. For I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. This morning, I want to conduct a neuropsychological experiment. And to do that, we're going to need to turn up the house lights a little bit because you're going to need to see each other. And what I'm going to need you to do is I'm going to need you to focus right in on this napkin right here. We're going to put it up on the side screens so that those of you who are up in the remnant section in the back can see this. But I want you to focus on this item right here. In just a few moments, I'm going to remove that napkin, and what is under that napkin are a number of objects. And what we are going to test is how long it takes you to identify, to perceive what these objects are. And the way we're going to do this is I'm going to remove the napkin, and the instant that you perceive what those objects are, I want you to raise your right hand. Now, as you're doing that, in the instant that you identify these objects, I want you to identify which of these objects is your favorite. And you will do that by raising your right hand, and if it is the object on the left, first finger, middle object, second finger, third object, third finger. If you just like the middle object, don't raise just the middle finger. That's two fingers, not one finger. All right, so I want to make sure everybody's paying attention. Do you know what your right hand is? If you know what your right hand is, raise your right hand. I need 100% participation, because if you do not participate in this scientific experiment, it either means that you are ignorant or belligerent. So your choice. You can sit there and not put your hand up, but you are skewing the results to the percentage of people who are either ignorant or belligerent. I'll leave it to you to decide. But the test is, as soon as I remove that napkin, the instant you perceive what those items are, raise your right hand, and in that same instant, identify which of these items is your favorite. If you cannot decide which of these items is your favorite, raise all 5 fingers. If you are still belligerent and don't want to decide, just raise your fist. Now, I want you to keep your hands up high enough so that you can look around the room and gauge the response of the people here. And the most important part is to do it instantly. As quickly as you perceive what these objects are, raise your hand. As fast as your mind can process it. Everybody understand? We're ready? I'm going to be looking. I'm going to be calculating. I'm going to be observing. Know who the ignorant and belligerent are. And we're ready to go. So everybody's looking at this napkin. In 3, 2, 1. All right, look around. Lots of 2s, lots of 1s, lots of 3s. Not a lot of belligerent or ignorant people. Okay, you put your hands down. Now, what we have just conducted is a very clumsy, very crude scientific experiment on human perception. How do we perceive the universe around us? It's a clumsy experiment because if this were really an empirical exercise in trying to determine how we perceive the world around us, we would have been in small groups, maybe 4 or 5 people. We would have had the same 3 pieces of fruit. We would have had the same process, but we would have filmed it so that we could measure in terms of fractions of seconds how long it takes for you to perceive that these are 3 pieces of fruit, and in the same instant to perceive which of those is your favorite item of fruit. It's a clumsy test that we've devised because we can't really tell, and I realize there are some of you who took a moment or two to raise your hand, and that's the design of the experiment. Because our human perception operates instantaneously in ways that are almost beyond calculation. And this is the problem. I mean, the second reason that this is a clumsy experiment is because the subject of human perception is incredibly complex. How do we know what we know? How do we understand and interpret and process the universe that we live in? It's not just a scientific issue. The solution to how we know what we know is not just empirical, and it's not biological. It's not even physiological or neurological. It's also psychological. And I believe it's also spiritual and theological. We understand what the world around us means. We perceive the world, not just because of what we are told in the empirical data, but we understand what the world means because of what we believe. Now, this is not an original idea. People have struggled with, and the technical name for this is epistemology. How do we know what we know? What is the meaning of meaning? What is reality? How do we discern the universe around us? And this has been the subject of philosophers and scientists and investigations for thousands of years. In fact, the first formal conversations about epistemology and understanding human perception and human consciousness were some of the conversations among the great Greek philosophers. And they had a word, they had one word in the Greek language that came to represent how we know what we know. And it's the Greek word logos. Logos simply means word. But in the Greek mindset, in the philosophical mindset of the ancient Greeks, the logos was the thing that gave meaning to the chaos of the universe. The logos was the thing that separated meaninglessness from meaningfulness, that separated chaos from order. That was the logos. And these conversations about epistemology took place in the Greek intellectual circles in the academy for hundreds of years. And as the Roman Empire began to flourish, these conversations were empowered throughout the Roman Empire. They began in Athens, in the source code of Greek philosophy, and it spread to Rome and then to Alexandria in Egypt. And by the first century, the center of these epistemological conversations had moved further to the east, to a city called Pergamum in eastern Turkey. But in 37 BC, Caesar Augustus decided to move the capital, the proconsulate of the Eastern Roman Empire, from the city of Pergamum to the city of Ephesus on the southeastern coast of what is now Turkey. He decided to do this to honor one of his favorite military commanders, a general named Celsus. And in the 150 years that followed, the city of Ephesus exploded financially and culturally and socially and in population and politically. Its influence grew across the entire region. In fact, it was during this century that one of the marvelous amphitheaters of the Roman Empire was built there in Ephesus. You can go see it today. It's twice the size of this room. And they didn't just have theatrical performances there. They had intellectual lectures and philosophical debates. And they would have 3,000 and 4,000 people attend these debates in Ephesus. And Ephesus was populated by temples and by lecture halls. In fact, in the city of Ephesus, there is a temple that is considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It is the temple of Diana, a temple that was dedicated to the goddess Diana and a place for conversations about the understanding of the gods and the world and the universe that we lived in. It was near the end of the first century that the Roman emperor wanted to pay tribute to his friend Celsus after he died. And so he commissioned the building of a great library in Ephesus. If you go to Ephesus to this day, you'll see the archaeological remains of the library and the facade of the library, which is magnificent, which has been reconstructed. It took them almost 50 years to build it. When it was dedicated sometime around 110 AD, it was said that the library in Ephesus was second only to the library in Alexandria. And the library in Ephesus was said to have 12,000 scrolls, which would be the rough equivalent of our day of a library that had 12 million books. Almost all of the published materials, almost a portion, a large percentage of the written materials that existed in that day were housed in the city of Ephesus in the library of Celsus. It was in 52 AD that a converted rabbi, Saul of Tarsus, who we know of as the Apostle Paul, brought his misfit ragtag band of evangelists across Central Asia into the city of Ephesus. The Apostle Paul didn't stay long in Ephesus in 52 AD because he was eager to get to northern Greece, to visit the churches of Colossae and Thessalonica and Philippi. But he noticed that the culture in Ephesus was intriguing. And it was a year later he began his second missionary journey, leaving the city of Antioch, traveling through Asia Minor, and he went directly to the city of Ephesus. And he stayed in Ephesus for 2.5 years until September of 56 AD. And during that time, the strategy that the Apostle Paul had as he was propagating the gospel throughout the Roman Empire was to begin in the synagogues first. It made perfect sense because the Apostle Paul was a trained rabbi. He was a Pharisee. And so his strategy was to go into a new city and go into the synagogues and provoke a conversation with the religious-minded people, the Jewish people in that city. He would say, have you guys heard of the Messiah? You know, the Messiah, and he would quote Isaiah, or he would quote Daniel, or he would bring his theological knowledge of the Hebrew scriptures to the fore and say, I want to tell you who this Messiah is. And he would tell the people about the life and the teachings and the death and the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And he was wildly successful at this pattern of evangelism until he got to Ephesus. Because Ephesus was a city that was dominated by Greek philosophy. And when he went to the synagogue, it tells us in Acts chapter 19 that the people in the synagogue were so belligerent that they refused to hear him anymore. And Paul said, okay, I'm not going to begin in the synagogue in Ephesus. I'm going to go to the lecture hall of Tyrannus. I'm going to debate at the philosophical level with the thought leaders of the culture of the city of Ephesus. And what took hold in the city of Ephesus was a work of God that was unparalleled in the Roman Empire. The church in Ephesus exploded. And before Paul left in 56 AD, he left 2 of his most prized disciples to shepherd the church in Ephesus. Their names were Priscilla and Aquila. And they were the pastors of that church for over a decade. Now, there is a religious tradition, and it's a fairly reliable one, that says that the Apostle Paul was executed by the Emperor of Rome, beheaded in 64 AD. That is the same time that the church in Ephesus got a new pastor. And the new leader of the church in Ephesus was none other than the Apostle John. John, the brother of James, the sons of thunder. John, the one who self-described as the disciple Jesus loved. It was John who lived 30 years in Ephesus until he was banished in exile to the island of Patmos, where sometime around 100 AD, he wrote the final book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. But he spent 30 years in Ephesus, in a culture that was layered over with the pursuit of how do we know what we know? The pursuit of the LOGOS. And it was while he was in the pastorate in the church of Ephesus that he wrote the story of Jesus that we have in our Bibles, the book of John. And it's there that John begins his story of who Jesus is with this astonishing sentence. In the beginning was the LOGOS, the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was, the LOGOS was, with God in the beginning. It says that the LOGOS made everything. Everything that was made through him. Nothing that has been made was made apart from him. He says that in him, in the Logos, is life. And that life is the light of all mankind. And that light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. What John was saying in the most profound of ways is the Logos is how we know what we know. It is the Logos that gives meaning to life. It is the Logos that separates meaninglessness from meaningfulness, that separates order from chaos, that separates right from wrong and good from evil. And the Logos is God. Now, John believed this not only because of who Jesus was, but because of the writings of Moses. See, it's no coincidence that John began his story of who Jesus was with the very same words that Moses began his story in the Pentateuch, in the first words of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, when Moses was explaining who God was. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, he says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Now the earth was formless and void, formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering above the waters. And then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God separated the light from the darkness. Look at Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and see if you don't understand what Moses was trying to say. Moses was saying that God was the uncaused first cause. In the beginning, God. From the very beginning, the uncaused first cause, the author and creator of the universe was God. But then in verse 2, he says, "But the earth was tohu vabohu." It's the Hebrew for formless and void, formless and empty, meaningless chaos. And it describes the darkness over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God separated from the waters, and that there was no order until, what does it say in verse 3? There was light. But how did the light come to be? God spoke. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Look at John 1:1 again. What does John say? He says, "In the beginning was the Logos," was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. There was all through him, all things were made. There is nothing that has been made that he didn't make. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. What John is saying is that the Logos is Jesus. That the Logos is what gives meaning to our world. It is the Logos that is embedded in everything in the universe. It is how we know what we know. That the core of our being, the core of our existence, we only understand it because of him. Because he gave the universe meaning. Now, if that's true, we have to ask ourselves some questions. If it's true that God is the Logos, that God is what gives meaning, that God is what separates the light from the darkness, order from the chaos, that God is the one who gives meaning to our suffering, and God is the one who gives meaning to our victories, and God is the one who gives meaning to every breath that we take, then we have to reorient how we see the world around us, how we see ourselves in the world. We have some serious work to do because our God is too small. Because if it's God who breaks down the definition and allows us to understand the meaning of the universe, if God is the Logos, which John is saying, then what are you worried about? What are you afraid of? What are you anxious for? What are you striving for? What are you struggling with? If God is the source of the meaning of all things, then the thing that matters is knowing the Logos, is investigating the Logos. Because the more I know about God, the more I know about the universe. And the more I know about the universe, the more I know about God. See, this is the question of human perception. And it is no small question. It is the question. How do we know what we know? What is the meaning of meaning? Well, the advocacy, the preposterous, outrageous suggestion of John in John chapter 1 is that is the Logos, and that is God, who is Jesus. So the more we know about him, the more we know about the universe we live in, and the more we study the universe we live in, the more it teaches us about him. See, it's not just an empirical study. It's not just a scientific test. It's not simply a psychological evaluation. It's not a neurobiological, chemical thing. It's all of these things and more. There's a modern neurophilosophical theory that says we don't see objects. We don't. When you saw these three things here, you didn't see a red oval and an orange circle and a green-brown kind of unusual ellipse of some shape. You knew immediately that this was an apple, an orange, and a pear. And you knew that because we don't see objects, we see meaning. We see what things mean. If we don't understand what they mean, we can't process them. So they have to have meaning. It's an experiment. If you're walking down the street and suddenly there's an unusual sound behind you, what happens? You instantly, reflexively turn to see what that sound is because you can't identify it. It has no meaning. And if it's a car that's about to run you over, it's important that you know what that is. Or if it's a dog that's about to bite you in the leg, you need to know what that is. But if it's just something that fell down a stairs or some object of no consequence, we hear, we feel, we smell. All of our sensory perception is processed through not only what it is, but what it's not, and what it is in comparison to other things. And the more we investigate, the deeper our meaning is. Did any of you notice that this is a very orange? Did you say, that doesn't look right? Well, you weren't far from the truth because this is a real orange. This is not. You could tell that, couldn't you? There were some of you who perceived that orange just doesn't look right, particularly when you compare it to this orange. But this is how we understand the universe. We understand the world around us by not just what the objects are, but by what they mean. And they find their meaning in the Logos. We find their meaning in our value system, in our ethics, in our morality, and in our beliefs. That's why in an instant you could decide which of these or none of these were your favorite. Because it's how we perceive the world. And God is that. The more we understand about the universe we live in, the more we know about God. And the more we know about God, the more clear our understanding of the universe that we live in. That's why I can say that your God is too small. A number of years ago, Diane and I were snorkeling in the Caribbean. I know, what a life I live. Oh my gosh. I'm snorkeling in the Caribbean with my hot wife, and we're there, and I'm having a great time. And it is a life of luxury, I gotta tell you. I love snorkeling. I've only scuba dived once and I thought it was amazing. But snorkeling in the Caribbean, if you've ever been, you can be in 20 feet of water and it looks like you're 2 feet away from the bottom. The water's so clear, it's magical. It's like you're floating. And we were at an island, and I think it was in the British Virgin Islands or somewhere, and we're swimming along, and there's a reef, and the guide told us this is a shelf, and at the end of the shelf there's a trench. And the trench is thousands of feet deep. It literally falls off into a canyon. And I was swimming along, and I swam out to the edge of the reef, and I'm looking at the sea life and the coral and the fish, and all of a sudden it became black. And I couldn't see the bottom. I couldn't see how deep it was. Now, nothing changed about my buoyancy, nothing changed about what I was doing, but I was terrified. I was scared to death that I was going to sink into the hole. See, I think this is why we hold on to a God that is convenient for us, that is comfortable for us. We keep God as a hip pocket God. We cling to the idea of a manageable deity because the deep is intimidating to us. And it's dark. And it is unfathomable. It is beyond knowing. But I think what we learn from the first 5 verses of the book of John is that is what God wants for us. That our God is too small. Not because God is too small, but because we, in our comfort, allow God to be small. See, this isn't a homiletical device. This is not some rhetorical shock value. This is an invitation. It is an invitation to explore the depths, to search out the unknowable, to be in awe of God. Because our God is too small.